Castro culture, or cultura castreña, means culture of the hill forts, and is the archaeological term used to describe the material Celtic culture of the northwestern regions of the Iberian Peninsula, which includes modern-day northern and central Portugal, as well as Galicia, Asturias and western Leon. It is the culture most associated with the Galicians and Astures, and the culture was active from the end of the Bronze Age, circa 9th century BC, until the Roman conquest in the 1st century BC. Upon its emergence, the Castro culture was situated in the region extending from the Douro River up to the Minho River. Within a relatively short period of time, the Castro culture would expand northwards along the coast, as well as southwards, extending via the lower Douro River, and eastwards following the Cares River Valley, reaching the mountain ranges which separate the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula with that of the Central Plateau. Eventually, the Ave River Valley in Portugal would become the core region of this culture, with many small Castro settlements being established on well-communicated areas of high ground, which offered strategic vantage points to those who occupied the sites. As well as small Castro settlements, oppida or cividades were also constructed. Each of the aforementioned rivers empty into the Atlantic Ocean, and this, coupled with the fact the Castro culture initially expanded via the river valleys and western coastline, could indicate that they sprang from what was initially a seafaring group. Here is what Barry Cunliffe has to say on the matter. Quote, "Within the Atlantic system, there was always a tension created by oppositions. The individual regions were remote from each other, yet were bound by the ocean, while the seaward-looking aspect of the Atlantic communities was held in check by the communication links, mainly along the great rivers, which linked the littoral to the more distant inland systems. When the whole Atlantic facade is considered in detail, its varied nature comes into sharper focus. We may distinguish the narrowing seas which serve as antechambers between the open Atlantic and other seas, to the north, leading to the North Sea and the Baltic, and to the south, to the Mediterranean. These narrowing seas were choke points in the maritime system where shipping activities concentrated, and in consequence, many ports developed. Then there were the major routes of entry along the great rivers flowing to the Atlantic. In almost every case, at the point where the wide estuary narrowed to a convenient width for bridging, a port developed. These routes of entry served not only the immediate hinterlands, but also provided long lines of communication thrusting deep into Europe." End quote. It is generally thought that the Castro culture emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Atlantic Bronze Age trade network, which was a cultural complex which included various cultures in Britain, Ireland, France, Portugal and Spain, and which existed approximately between the period of 1300 and 700 BC. The trade network was characterised by its economic and cultural exchange, which resulted in a high degree of cultural similarity shared between these coastal communities of Western Europe, Britain and Ireland. This can be evidenced by the frequent use of stone used as a defence in the form of chevaux de frise, the construction of coastal cliff castles, which served as protective interfaces between land and sea, as well as the domestic architecture, which is characterised by roundhouses. Most scholars agree that this trade network extended from the Mediterranean to Sweden and Denmark, and that this maritime network linked together regional centres which were focused on the extraction and production of metals, as well as the exchange of prestige items. Here is what Professor Barry Cunliffe has to say on the matter. Quote, "These maritime flows are best appreciated from the distribution maps of bronze artefacts found along the Atlantic facade, representing communication in the period centering on 1500 to 500 BC. Tools and weapons of this kind could have travelled in a variety of social contexts, as gifts, useful commodities of exchange, or as scrap metal. Some novel types may have inspired local craftsmen to modify their own designs or production methods. In this way, ideas and technological concepts spread along the Atlantic seaways. The evidence of maritime contact is particularly clear in the Late Bronze Age, at which time large quantities of metal were being moved from place to place. The example of the disc-footed fibula is instructive. Fibulae of this general type are well known in northwestern Iberia and in Aquitania, and although there are typological differences, the similarities are close enough to suggest that the two zones were exchanging ideas in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Fibulae of closely similar type have also been found in the southwest peninsula of Britain, at Harlyn Bay in Cornwall and Mountbatten near Plymouth in Devon. In the whole of the British Isles, the type is otherwise unknown. The implication must surely be that the fibulae from Devon and Cornwall were either imported along the Atlantic seaways or were made locally in imitation of imports. By what means the items travelled must remain unknown, but among the various options we should not forget the possibility that they may have been worn by women who were sent as gifts or came as brides to cement social allegiances between distant elites." End quote. The main centres of this Atlantic Bronze Age trade network seem to be modern-day England, Ireland, northwestern France and western Iberia, which many scholars argue was due to the fact resources such as tin and gold were present in these locations. Quote, "Social and economic interaction along the Atlantic facade has been a recurring phenomenon since the early Bronze Age for a number of obvious reasons. Tin is a scarce resource only available in a few places, among them Cornwall in southern England, northern Portugal and Brittany, and perhaps also Ireland. In fact, tin can only be extracted here or Central Europe. Gold and silver are also scarce metals, gold being available in Ireland and gold and silver in Portugal. Add to this the more frequent occurrence of copper ores rather easily accessible, and it seems obvious that connections should develop between these regions." End quote. Items which were associated with this culture, which includes socketed and double-ring bronze axes, lunate spearheads, swords and V-notched shields, are usually found in hoards which have been ritually deposited in lakes, rivers and bogs. Elite feasting equipment such as cauldrons, articulated spits and flesh hooks are also found from central Portugal to Scotland, reflecting a practice in which the feast was a central hub in which social articulation was facilitated at an elite level. The widespread distribution of these luxury items suggests that this concept of the feast was embedded into the social system of these various Atlantic communities. In 2008, John T. Cook attributed the origins of the Celts to this period, and Barry Cunliffe, in support of this theory, argued that this is where the Celtic language developed, as an Atlantic lingua franca or trade language, before spreading to mainland Europe. During the last 2 centuries of the 2nd millennium BC, settlements were established along the coastal areas of northern Portugal, from the Mondego River up to the Minho. These settlements were reminiscent of the open settlements which were characteristic of the Bronze Age, often being established in high, well-communicated areas which were in close proximity to the valleys, which often contained rich agricultural land. During this period, the inhabitants specialised in the production of Atlantic Bronze Age metallurgy, such as the luxury feasting items which we mentioned earlier, as well as being involved in the trade of other prestige items, via an extensive network spanning from the Mediterranean to the British Isles. By the time of the 1st millennium BC, the large-scale production of these luxury items seemed to cease, and the trade network appears to collapse, most likely due to the fact iron began to replace the need for tin and bronze products. During this period, the production of items was limited to the production of axes and tools, as can be evidenced from the hoards which have been discovered along the European Atlantic coast. During this transitional period between the Bronze and the Iron Ages, Up along the coasts of Galicia and along the Douro River in modern-day northern Portugal, the open-style settlements were abandoned in favour of artificially fortified hill forts. These forts were small in comparison to their predecessors, and the locations in which they were built, usually hills or peninsulas, were chosen for their long-range visibility as well as their natural defensive capabilities. These hill forts were built with additional defences such as earthen walls, battlements and ditches, which enclosed an inner space, which was mostly reserved for communal activities. This internal space often featured circular, round or oblong huts, which were sometimes reinforced with low stone walls, and the main feature inside these huts was often the hearth. This transitional period between the Bronze and Iron Ages for the Castro culture is often described by scholars as the wider community collectively investing in important resources, focusing their labour on the communal spaces and their defences at the expense of the elites, which is reflected in the minor importance which was given to the production of prestige items during this period. By the beginning of the 6th century BC, Castro culture began to expand. This expansion saw the smaller hill forts being abandoned, with hundreds of new settlements being founded, often near valleys in proximity to rich land which was suitable for farming. These new, larger settlements were often protected by several lines of defence, which included ditches, ramparts, as well as stone walls. These new settlements featured grouped, or what is often thought to be family housing, in the form of multiple residences which were in close proximity to one another, and these often featured shared granaries and workshops. These groups of family residences resulted in a decrease of the communal open space within the hill fort. Quite often, the remaining communal space was utilised instead for shared forges, communal halls and even saunas. These communities during this period had their own self-sufficient but somewhat isolated economy, but this would change due to the return of trade links with the Eastern Mediterranean. This was facilitated due to a now independent Carthage expanding its political and economic hegemony across the Western Mediterranean. Due to the large number of finds, which include personal jewellery and personal care items such as fibulae, pins, pendants, earrings and torques, the importance of personal appearance seems to have remained consistent, and these findings imply a departure from an egalitarian society with the development of a privileged class who had better access to items of prestige. The 2nd century BC saw the expansion of some hill forts into fortified, semi-urbanised towns, which were referred to by classical authors as oppida. These oppida could support some few thousand occupants, and in some instances they were larger in population than the cities which were established by the Romans a century later. These cividades, or cities as they are locally referred, often feature evidence of urban planning, as well as other innovations such as reservoirs designed to contain a supply of drinking water, paved streets with channels for rainwater runoff, and public bathhouses. The outer defence of the cividades were concentric rings of ditches and stone walls, sometimes up to 5 in number, which were sometimes also reinforced with towers. Inside the walls, the dwelling places were arranged in what is described as a family nucleus, which was a group of dwelling spaces which were arranged around an inner paved yard, which were sometimes equipped with fountains, drains or reservoirs. These dwelling spaces are frequently outer-walled, and the family nucleus also included buildings which served as kitchens, workshops, granaries and the like. The centre of these cividades also featured an acropolis, an inner and upper-walled space which was sparsely, if at all, populated. The Punic Wars of 264 to 146 BC was the first time that members of the Castro culture had come into contact with the Romans. This was due to the fact that members of these Celtic tribes had begun to fall into the service of the Carthaginians as mercenaries. Silius Italicus, in his works Punica, describes the Galicians as follows. Quote, "Rich Gallicia sent its youths, wise in the knowledge of divination by the entrails of beasts, by feathers and flames, who, now crying out the barbarian song of their native tongue, now alternately stamping the ground in their rhythmic dances until the ground rang, and accompanying the playing with sonorous kai-tri." End quote. In the aftermath of the Punic Wars, the Romans focused their attention on conquering Hispania and made incursions into Lusitanian lands. The Galicians would join forces with the Lusitanians, but they were ultimately unsuccessful in their efforts. In retaliation to this contingent, Decimus Junius Brutus subsequently led a successful incursion into Galician territory, exacting revenge and earning himself the title of Calicus in the process. By the time of 19 BC, in the aftermath of the defeat of the Asturians and Cantabrians, the local powers finally would submit to Rome, and much of the Roman way of life was adopted. By the 2nd century AD, most of the hill forts and oppida would be abandoned in favour of Romanised settlements, which were established in the plains and valleys. That's going to conclude our look at the Castro culture of the Iberian Peninsula. If you enjoyed the video, please consider checking out one of my others. Thanks to everyone who watches, and for all of the support. Catch you on the next one. Old Boy, out.